Hi, I'm Elizabeth Barnett. I teach English here at Rockhurst, and I'm the new director of the Midwest Poets Series. Thank you all for being here. Thanks also to Rockhurst for giving the series a physical home, a spiritual home, and the financial support that comes with being our home. The Missouri Arts Council also supports the series, for which we're very grateful. Christina Byers has contributed invaluable labor and wisdom behind the scenes. Cynthia Cartwright's work as the director of the Center for Arts and Letters makes this series and many other cultural events at Rockhurst possible. If you'd like to learn more about these events, such as our next poet, Marcus Jackson's reading on Wednesday, November 14th, please fill out a green card at the reception and book signing, which will be held in the lobby immediately after tonight's reading. We hope you will all join us there for food, wine, and conversation. Can y'all hear me? Okay. It is a special honor to welcome Bob Stewart back to Rockhurst. Bob created this series 36 years ago, and he is why we're here tonight. Bob has brought some of the finest poets writing in English to the Mabee Theater and Arupe Auditorium and the Convocation Center and the Art Gallery. I've learned tonight there are many places that people have read here that I didn't know about, from Terrence Hayes to Jericho Brown to Claudia Rankin. Poets who've read here have won the MacArthur, the Pulitzer, even Nobel Prizes. More importantly, they've opened new possibilities of perception and community in their work. Bob convinced them to come to this small campus where thousands of Kansas Cityans have heard them with our own ears and then carried their poetry forward into our lives. Thank you for doing this good work, Bob. Across the street at UMKC, Bob edits the literary magazine New Letters, for which he's won many awards, including the National Magazine Award. Bob's taste, personality, and intellect make that journal what it is, and he generously teaches the art of publishing as well as writing as a UMKC professor. It's common for poet editors to eventually drop the poet. The negative capability of being a good editor and getting inside other poets' work can make it difficult to find your way back to your own. Luckily, Bob's poetry has a strong beacon. Bob has said that what you're really wanting is that moment of intensity, that people feel something deeply, and that's a poem. In a world that abounds in the sort of passionate intensity that William Butler Yeats has described, the poetic intensity that Bob talks about here is paradoxically a kind of antidote. By helping us feel what others feel, it teaches empathy, which we all sorely need. And his poems have made me feel connected to speakers I never would have imagined, from divorced men in bars to slightly lecherous men in church. Here I go with them. And they're all wonderful and human and fully alive. I'm grateful that Bob is here tonight to share this life-affirming intensity as he reads to us from his newest book, Working Class, as well as his previous books. Working Class is out this year from Stephen F. Austin University Press, and you can buy it as well as Plumbers in the lobby after the reading. So please join me in welcoming Bob Stewart.
All right. Good. Thank you. Thank you, Elizabeth. What did I do? All right, I've already messed up. Now I can see that. All right. I do want to thank Elizabeth Barnett for inviting me here as the first reader in her tenure as director of Midwest Poet Series. It's an incredibly gracious thing to do. And I also want to say a word about all the people I worked with over the years as director of Midwest Poet Series and Rockhurst itself for sustaining this series for now 36 years. That's quite an accomplishment. And Rockhurst became a kind of second home for me, and my colleagues over here, Patricia Clary Miller and Dan Martin and Charlie Kovich and Patricia Clary Miller, all of them just wonderful people. And especially, without doubt, I don't think I would have lasted 35 years without my colleague Cynthia Cartwright, director of the Center for Arts and Letters here at Rockhurst. It's just been great, and I intend to keep those friendships going, by the way. You're not going to get rid of me. Some people have said that I should write an article about my experiences as director of Midwest Poet Series, and I just want to let you know I have done that. It was published by KC Studio Magazine, if you want to go online and find it. And it's some of the adventures. I used to drive an old Bronco in which I shuttled all these poets around, and so there's some interesting adventures in there. I happen to think of one of picking up the Native American poet Adrian Lewis at the airport, who told me on the way into Kansas City that he had no intention of doing a reading tonight unless I could take him to a hospital so he could get an EKG first. So we stopped off at Truman Medical Center, and I put him in line with some convicts from the city jail. And he got an EKG, and he came out, and he said, "Okay, I'm ready to read now." So anyway, you can read some of that if you want to. I'm going to start with a couple of poems from from a book called Plumbers that we published in a revised edition just about a year or two ago. And Plumbers is a kind of a motif or a topic that runs through many of my poems. I really can't get rid of it. I come from a family of plumbers, and I worked as a plumber myself for a while. I still would be a plumber, except that I'm incredibly slow, and I just never make any money. So this poem is called Waiting for the Plumber. Things seldom leak where they drip. A thin layer of water may disguise itself as chrome or travel the patterns of wallpaper into your bed at night. Perhaps a flashing has come loose on the roof, or war has broken out on the other side of the world. Transgressions start long before they come through the wall. Just get a pan till the plumber arrives. There are women, too, whose lives seep out into their children almost overnight, yet you cannot find the breaches of love in their eyes. This, too, is a plumber's nightmare. The simplest gestures may baffle as soon as they leave our hands. The congressman on his way to prison says he will wear his conviction like a badge of honor. You know the corrosion lies far back in the plumbing, where elbows, T's, and Y's can turn us around, unable to tell the source from the ends, where the water itself begins making false statements. And maybe just one more from this book, Plumbers. There are other things in this book besides plumber poems, but I have to move on. You'll see this motif showing up in a number of my poems. This one's called Keeping Up. It's dedicated to a foreman I had I worked on a sewer repair crew for a long time. And this foreman's name was Joe. Interestingly enough, on that crew, at one time, I was working with Joe, who was a first-generation Italian immigrant, and there was a black man on the crew. There was a Polish immigrant, and an Irish immigrant, and me. And I thought, wow, this is like amazing. This is like it, the world. Anyway, this is dedicated to Joe. Keeping Up. My foreman with the sewer district took his breaks reading philosophy in the crew shed, told me the ultimate reality on this crew is monistic. You have to keep up. In the shed, you could contemplate Kant. Is metaphysics possible? But on the street, you hang to the jackhammer, break through all the possibilities of pavement without trying to separate great ideas from bad. The reductionism of contemporary oil asphalt, to the verification of Descartes and Hobbes, the poured concrete of hard-hearted rationalists, down to the cobblestone of romantic St. Louis, when kids at Bellevue School used to recite the Intimations Ode, and the stages of their lives shed each visionary gleam, broke in blocks red as the day my immigrant uncle helped lay them, across de Bolivar, past the Italian groceries, in the day when I was yet an unborn soul. Joe said, cut and crumb that hole till the top of your head grows dark, and each shovelful of dirt comes steadily as premises of life you simply count on. You'll find yourself standing in the deepest thought you need. Now dig. So anyway, that's some poems from Plumbers. I also want to read a few newer poems. Some of them aren't terribly new. When I talk about newer poems, I'm talking about like 2 years. Some of these are even older than that, but they're untested. And so I thought I'd read a few of those before I get on to the book, Working Class. My particular poems have a sort of an affection for the narrative, but they go in between the narrative and the lyrical, and so I'm not afraid of narrative poems, so you'll see that kind of shifting back and forth. In particular, this one poem, some of you might notice a lot of references to St. Louis, which is where I'm from. And this poem is called My Father's Haunt. It's pretty interesting about this poem because it originally was called My Father's Tavern. And somebody was doing a book on ghost poems, and I wanted to send them a poem. So I just changed the title to My Father's Haunt. And sure enough, it got accepted. It's kind of ghost-like anyway, I think, this poem. So, one word, and the change in that word, I think, just made the poem, it just made the poem different. It opened it up altogether. Okay, here it is. As a tavern by a mountain stream, in a poem by Ho Xuan Hong, Wayland's bar has hot dogs and chili in the back room, whoops like owls in the bamboo, and NFL Rams burning carbs on the big screen. I stop in, my pickup's tailgate back to the front window, and ask, what's on tap? You aren't from here, someone yells among keg-like shapes at the center table. Polish, German, Irish, black, and Italian. There's a picture of men in overalls with folding rules in their leg pockets, and I imagine a plumb line dropping from the upper floors of a world they built. I am from here. Work is work, beer's a beer. I pincer out a hot dog from rust-colored cooker water and waddle its neck loose of what could be dew or acid rain in the faded glow. I like these guys and know them. And the barmaid, whose bush light seems to answer all questions, even mine. Where is my father? We'd call this place. And here, tossed around in the hands of buddies like a fish hard to catch, our own last name, Stewart, laboring in the valley of imagination, being served. This actually This may be the newest poem. This is what you always want to hear, isn't it? I just wrote this poem about a month ago. How I Stopped the Chickens from Getting Out. I packed duct tape over the hook and eye the hens pecked at. While the roll was out, I pressed a strip over the planter wart I suspected on the sole of my foot and stood on it. I could see then the horse would not hold for shoeing, so I remembered to hang a strip of duct tape off his nose to calm him down. That did it. Immediately after lunch, I could walk the road with the dog, whose collar I had studded with duct tape to keep down fleas. As I read once on the humor page of the New Yorker, thinking it was serious. The dog and I started to run, taking my heart for granted. Even if last night my closest sister appeared in my dream as having died. If they find a leak in a valve, I tell my wife, duct tape my mouth silver or gray for my tendency to embellish a story and regretting it afterward. So these are just a few new poems, I should say untested poems. Some of them aren't too new. This is called Wishes for the World. I want to be down on my knees, pulling radishes in the garden, raised bed or spaded dirt. And if a stranger comes along, I want to point her way with a radish or a bunch of mustard greens already tied with twine and lying in a basket with tomatoes. I want to lift the nest lid mornings and trouble the comfortable. Getting pecked, sure, but that's what I want. I want brown eggs so fresh the shells hardly crack on the cast iron ridge of the skillet. Scramble them in chopped radishes, greens. You see all this coming together over cool slices of those very tomatoes. It doesn't sound like much, but there are so many refugees. I want also to hold their babies a while and let feeling return to their arms. And I want to say sometimes when I was a kid, we had nothing for breakfast but donuts. Okay. All right. A lot of times people will ask you, if you're a teacher or if you're a poet, where you get your ideas, what you write, how to figure out what you write about. And I always think back to a long, long time ago when I was in my 20s, and there was a woman poet here in Kansas City, long gone now, named Virginia Scott Minor. And does anybody know her? Remember her? Yeah. And she said to us, she said, write about your obsessions. Well, it's interesting. Nothing could be more true. And sometimes you don't even realize what your obsessions are, though, until you write about them. And after this, I've been looking through these poems in preparation for this reading, and there's just a sort of 3 or 4, I won't tell you what they are. I'm not going to make it easy on you, but you can see that plumbing, ditch digging, religion comes in a lot. And I'm also actually maybe I will tell you, but I'm not going to keep any secrets. References to the Vietnam War just are all over my poems for some reason. I didn't go to Vietnam. I was in the Navy at the time, which is like not being to war at all. You know, it's not that bad. But it had a tremendous effect on me. And it just keeps showing up in different ways in these poems, and I think you'll see it. In fact, one little way is a new poem, fairly new poem also. Where is it? This is a poem called Tasks Done and Undone. There's an epigraph by Walt Whitman, I pass death with the dying and birth with the new-washed babe, and am not contained between my hat and boots. Whitman. Okay, here it goes. Better today if I had gone home to work on the wooden gate, which is coming apart. But the robin has hatched her brood on the downspout nearby and stares at me if I get close or make the gate groan. As in a poem I read recently, with the opening line thus: "Would everybody stop dying, please?" Whitman no longer is contained between hat and boots, and Roth this morning announced his silence. And Pope Francis himself says in a movie he is not immortal. The Pope. So I repeat, don't die, please. And still agree to carry the casket of my pal Bob at Jefferson Barracks National Cemetery on his way through the squeaky gate. I am a realist. I wanted to read that because Bob's birthday is tomorrow and he died about 6 months ago. From what the VA hospital diagnosed as the effects of Agent Orange when he was in Vietnam. So the Vietnam War is still killing my friends. Makes you a little angry sometimes. All right, enough of that. I'm going to read one more new poem, and then I'll switch to the... This is a poem called The Envelope, and my grandmother came to America from Sicily when she was about 21 years old, and she was a Lupo. Lena Lupo. And her marriage to my grandfather was already arranged, so they got married, they lived in Chicago for quite a while. And anyway, when I was a boy, every once in a while an envelope would arrive from Sicily. And I still remember the handwriting on the front of that envelope and wondered, how in the world does the post office find her? You know, it's like, wow, that was something. Anyway, sometimes those envelopes would have a black border around them, which meant that someone back in the old country had died. And on more than one occasion, I remember my grandmother refusing to open the envelope because she didn't want to find out who it was. So I've just told you the whole poem. So I'll read it to you anyway to see if there's anything left. The envelope. The arrival, bordered black. Word of death from the old country, which the boy's grandmother would leave intact on her dresser and would point to it from her table and would weep at first for Anthony, then Maria, then imagine a child had returned too soon to heaven and named there in the filmy document. Her candles grew in number each time she dreamed of another inhabitant massed inside those seams and corners. Our lights flickered in her bureau mirror, child, cousin, brother, the words on paper unconsumed. No good news in the folds of someone's last thoughts while making the sauce, perhaps, or parking the machine. Return to the heart, said Augustine, Bishop of Hippo. In the heart you hear what also you can see, where also you can see all things as one. In this flat, all-knowing, one-ounce angel of morning, costing so, most mail would go by ship or by the slow, prop-driven island hoppers. Time had landed in a kind of stall, and all the present and the past appeared as through a low ceiling, or as the Lord right through a wall. I'll tell you now, I, the boy, might have opened the envelope and had it done, but I had come to love the sound of cries for everyone. All right. What else do I got stuff? I might jump back into that in a second, but I have to blow my nose. All right. This is a perennial problem. Not perennial, this is a lifelong problem. I remember there was a recording of me reading back in the 70s or 80s, and my pal Greg Field recorded it back in those days, and I'm sniffing all through it. You probably still have it. You should cut the sniffs out. All right. I do want to say one other thing about my own poems, and that is that if you look at these poems carefully, or if you care to, you would notice the influence that I've had that I've had from all of the poets I know, and many of them in this room. They're some of the best poets in the country in this audience right now, but I'm not nervous because I know you're very kind people. But what I learned, I could start naming names, but I realize that's a road I don't want to go down. And when I'm looking through these new poems and through this book, I can see the influence that all of these poets, these friends of mine here, these poets have had on my work. And I just can't really emphasize that enough. I wish I could do more to articulate it, but it's just so crucial to me in my life. So, all right, that's enough of that. Elizabeth, in running Midwest Poet Series, I always thought that my goal was that this would be like the Carnegie Hall of poet series. Or maybe the Apollo Theater, or whatever you want to choose. And it feels like that to me tonight. All right. Where do I go from here? I'll read a little short poem. This is a poem called To a Turtle. I am slow too. Here's the wide road. It's a chance. And a shell is, so far, a kind of wing to escape on. My house in Waldo, truck, have no value in this discussion. I'm talking how we move east at about 65, and you move north at what, 0.1? Nothing to distract you but a smell of water or the pool of the moon on your back like a dark headlight, you reckless driver. I actually have another poem it's not in the book about a turtle. I'm going to read it to you because it goes with it. Where is it? This is also pretty new, so forgive me. It's called Stopping in the Road for a Turtle. And there's a reference in here to a writer named Andre Dubus. And this is Andre Dubus II, because there's also an Andre Dubus III, who's a very prominent novelist and short story writer. But Andre Dubus II is his father, who is actually the real Andre Dubus. Andre Dubus, you might know him for a short story of his called A Father's Story. See, I can't even say the title without getting emotional. Tremendous story, overwhelming story. Anyway, so there's a reference. I was going to bring Andre Dubus II here to Midwest Poet Series, even though he's a prose writer. I had some prose writers here over the years. Luisa Valenzuela from Venezuela, or from Buenos Aires, and Sven Burkerts came, and other really great prose writers. But other people started bringing in prose writers and sort of serving that function. And so it was just easier for me to stick with the poets, and so I stopped. But I always wanted to bring in Andre Dubus II, but what happened to him was that he stopped in the highway to help some people whose car had stalled, and he was hit by a car and badly injured, and he couldn't travel except in first class with a first class attendant. And in those days, I think it was before Cynthia Cartwright came on and was magically raised money for us, that I couldn't afford to bring him in. So that's who this is. Anyway, stopping in the road for a turtle. Don't hiss at me. Andre Dubus rescued that brother and sister on a highway in Haverville. So let me here on 55th Street in Crestwood, 6:20 a.m., stop and help you over to the shrubs. Box turtles I had as a kid seemed mostly interior, but you, neck out, jaw wrenching from my index finger, throat clearing like an opera singer's, have less turtleness than serpent. How heroic of us both then, with the pace of such progress, to trust the car-full universe, when all Andre Dubus meant to do was act according to his nature, tough guy. It crippled him. On that road, father of many characters, and each always seems stranded outside a bar or even home, listening to some grieving soprano on the radio. Sing then, turtle, hiss your given voice. Okay, this one thing leads to another. That's what I was hoping for. But I promised somebody that I would read this poem. I'm not terribly musically inclined, but this poem kind of came out okay, in my view. It's called Fats, and it's a kind of a reference to the fact that some musicians, have the nickname Fats, which doesn't mean that they're actually fat. It means that their sound is fat, I think. Stanley can tell me. All right. All right, Fats. I just wrote this to prove people I could rhyme. There are good fats and bad fats. I'm talking to you, Fats. The skinny guy on stage with a sax thicker than your own leg. A leg that's a shred of bone and gabardine slacks. All solos take some greed for sound and ain't got no mama now by harmonica Fats. I got no need, no mama, not now. All that aside, you're Fats, whether narrow or wide, whether Waller doing the stride or a Creole gauging gastronomical survival guide. Listen to Domino. The fat man didn't mention food, Dashiell Hammett's Nick and Nora either, or what tune Pat Boone made off with. Ain't that a shame? It's in the name. Saturated or trans, mono or poly, sound stores up where the body has its need. We get our fats from a reed. All right. I'll switch back to working class. Let me see what time we're talking about. I have, in the past, run over time, and it's the worst thing that you can do when you're a poet. So I have a clock up here. All right. I'm going to read this poem. This is a little longer poem. I don't know what it is with me. This poem is, where'd it go? This poem is an homage to the 20th century. I hated to see it go, so I wrote a poem to the 20th century. There's a couple of stories in here. My father was a union boss, and he had large territory of the country. And he had to go on these job sites and make sure that people were doing the right thing. So there's a story, there's a little bit of that in this poem. No theory. Leave me here in the century where I was born. The old century of levers, knobs, vacuum tubes, furnace stacks, scrubbers, and lead filling the sky. Tons of lead, through which I sail like a bird born with a mysterious cell in its brain for the route home. Who walks the 100 years? Voice commands, retina twitches, turn and return from satellites now, without bones or muscles or clear membranes that protect the eye. I suppose getting lost no longer will be possible, or to be helpless and alone with only a prayer or raft made of railroad ties, which wobbles on a wave like love. Only now have I gotten the Ford truck to start in the driveway, its white cough appearing in the mirror, hazing the air between us, between my house and the power pole, a pole stitched with wires and cables, switches to those who know but do not talk. I love to sit in the cab and shudder with moisture while air and gasoline heat up the engine block and radiate energy into the hole that looks at God. In the rivers I know, a boy would not dare stick even a leg. Alligator gar gulping cattle carcasses, fertilizer, uranium, styrofoam packages, sulfites, latex particles, unrecycled refrigerators. Always we have been weighted down. And in 1968, I stood at the back door of Sheehan Plumbing Company on Delmar in St. Louis. The morning after the Memphis shooting, that shooting, with young Joe, the owner, and his big Irish green trailer and lengths of cast iron and clay pipe and half bricks that had set off alarms all night, piles of glass, copper fittings, and lead rings, the metal of the century, which yellowed the shop air when melting like gold breathing, and we breathed it. It's in there now, in our lungs, foiled onto each aspiration of the century, to stamp, press, to mold, cast, and cart the sky itself, as the morning of my birth, chalked with pigeon dung on the ledges and shoulders burnished bronze, where a white boy would not even be allowed to get himself so dirty. I did apply for work in the dung stables, the manholes shining with the backs of bugs, and once my father stood on a chair at a construction site to order 300 men back to work. They were protesting new faces in the United Nations of the Union, not far from the mines of central Missouri, where blacks had died as well, my father knew, in the great strike of 22, and heavy metals flowed with rainbows and coal into the creeks. You could taste what was silently offered from the ground from which we pulled this lead. I think I can still name my friends dead of mortar fire, half a world and full century away. They are lying low and fixed in stone, barely able even now to keep quiet. I should find a short poem. I do have a short poem here. So Lisa told me to read one funny one. No, two funny ones. It's hard to find them. I'll read this. I'd like to find another one, but I can't find it. I thought I had it written down. This is new too, so it's called Late for Mass. Quick stepping through the parking lot, a June morning, sweating for the repose of a soul yet to be known. And for Father Steve, may he be refreshed on his travels, but to wear is not for the late to learn. The substitute priest looks up from his missal for the arrival himself, to push open the tall wooden carved portals of acclamation. Although you have hidden these things from the wise and learned, he reveals to the penitent's face, refreshingly, for the soul does not repose, but wears a shirt ironed that morning and stands on a pew singing, my yoke is easy and my burden light. Okay. All right. There's a thing that my friends and I used to do when we were pretty young that we called silent running. And it was kind of a reckless, stupid thing to do. But we would get up, in the middle of the night, we would get up some speed on a road that right at the top of a bluff. And when we hit the bluff and started going downhill, we would turn off the engine and the lights and coast at very high speed for as far as we could go. And we would go for miles like that because it was high on the Missouri River bluffs on a windy road. And I also have to tell you that there's a reference here to the car, which I need to define for you because it's called a Studebaker. And a Studebaker doesn't exist anymore. But it was known for being a really streamlined car, and it looked the same on the front as it did on the back. And we gave this particular, my friend Dennis drove a Studebaker, a 1955 Studebaker Champion. And that was the Studebaker that we used. We gave it a nickname called the Stuckelmacher. This poem actually started out as an homage to another poet by the name of Weldon Keys, who grew up here in the Midwest in Missouri and Iowa, but is particularly known as a poet out in the Bay Area. And it might be useful to know that his car was found abandoned on the east end of the Golden Gate Bridge. And while some people think he committed suicide, others think that he just disappeared. And so it's one of those deals where people think they've seen him in Mexico and things like that. So this poem really started out as an homage to Weldon Keys, but it's really about that act of silent, what we called silent running. I think that's all that might be confusing. My poems are almost never confusing. I don't know if that's good or bad. There's not really made much of a difference to me, I guess. All right, so there's an epigraph from Weldon Keys. I took the thin moon and the sky for cover. The yellow Studebaker with comet tails of vomit trailing out each back window, like plastic streamers from handle grips on our old bikes. A backward-looking and forward-looking sea fish given the name Stuckelmacher on the bluffs. I don't need to tell you it was 2 a.m., a car nearly extinct and drawn as on a whiff of water from the Missouri, along Charbonneir Road and down the cataract of night, past Bottom Corn to the river. So we pledged our places for the front seat, put the drunks in back, the strongest on the roof, the flathead pistons churring like singer needles or insects in the trees, the whole high ground meant for speed shifting the wide U.S. gear pattern. For the moment we became nothing but momentum. Lights off, engine off. Imagine young men, their wheels, beer, bourbon, a green, sweet drink one bought for the girls, a theater the poet of theaters once called Moon of Midwest, then disappeared, saying, there are no exits. Prior to any act, Saturday afternoon confession at Little Flower Church, releasing the soul to its intersection of life and art. Christ, we would die the way deer sometimes do, dashing with darkened headlights, engine silenced for the road turned downward, those days when neutral would not lock the steering column. Everything loose, graveled, undercut for the gulf we knew would come, our war in the Delta, foliage and defoliage. So the young men of us took such freedom as a burden and a reason. Temptation, assembly, silence, run. Get up enough speed and shut down all systems. Release us into the night, O Lord, guided by the huge steering wheel, the hill, the asphalt, the U.S. steel. 2 young men splayed on the roof, usually Heights, usually Briggs. The life of each now flung into the jeweled and silent watch that winds itself, the stars. Let them disappear around that curve and reappear here in the light of our houses even now, just a blur in the quiet mood we all fell through, praising the name we'd given Studebaker at the time of its glory, and each boy of us going by fast as charcoal sketches of poles that lined the rows of corn and beans, the car slowing as it did always at the irrigation bridge, 1 inch farther, all we ever asked for, Lord, and then we stopped asking for anything more. You know, what's really spooky is that my friend Dennis, his name is Dennis Fennell, and he's a very, very widely published poet himself. He has 2 books with Georgia, and 1 book with the University of Massachusetts, and 2 or 3 other books. That phenomenon that I just read about, silent running, 35 years later, almost to the week, we each wrote poems with the same topic and title. And he lives in Massachusetts. Same week. He sent it to me. And his is better than mine. All right. So just a couple more, and then I'll let you go. This poem is called Given. Where is it? I want to be sure I'm ready. This poem is called Given Rats. This poem alludes to a story you might have heard of called Costco. And I actually have another poem about Costco that I like a lot. But I didn't put it in this book because I thought 2 poems about Costco in 1 book? I mean, this is not good for a reputation. So if I ever have another book, then my other Costco poem will be in there. But this poem is called Given Rats, and it's a little on the longer, it's about the same length. When I first started writing poems, I was writing really short poems. And I couldn't understand how people could write poems that were like 2 pages long. But it just happens to you. Okay. Given Rats. Last week at table, my wife and I shared an Irish cheese from Costco, favored on boards at receptions. But with us alone, I added an inexpensive cab to the cart, and she decided on Prosecco from Hy-Vee Party and Liquor on sale. And here, I think, I bored her senseless with a story of my sewer worker days and first wild rat face to face, which ambled toward me in a ditch. And it did amble, as if familiar with the story my mother told of her Chicago girlhood, being sent once to bring up a bottle of what they called Dago Red, and down there, in a place alone, met a rat she must have met in every dark corner or passage until the moment of her death. My rat in the ditch kept coming, I told my wife, big as a fox terrier and slickened, not attacking, but unconcerned by my existence, not blinded, but indifferent, not, as the faith assured me, turning away, but ever growing up the crumbling, sliding dirt, the sides, the ditch. I scrambled out. So when prisoner Louis Zaibo got his poems out, but not himself, anyone could read A Small Rat Crawls Through the Iron Bars, which passes for luck in China. But Pinochet must have put a rat in every cell in Chile to gnaw until it gives the dark a bellyful. They fought the dogs and killed the cats, Robert Browning somehow knew, when rat bite fever filled the river with our leftover sleep. Until this evening, I sit in my dining chair and rip a crust of artisan bread to dip into unfiltered olive oil from Costco, a gnaw of cheese and artichoke and jardinera if I dare, which my wife warns against but tries as well, its heat skittering in our mouths until out comes the wicked bishop in Southey's poem, hidebound and running from a wedge of rats, for they were sent to do judgment upon him, or at least out comes the line, wherein our judgment awaits the texture and fur of that girlhood memory, harbored here in the retelling's recurring fall through a dark catechism and its single squeak. Truly, thou art God who hides thyself, which gnaws clean through to this act of lifting the cup of reflection upon wine and cheese, virtues of the better olive oils, all transfigurations of ourselves. All right, one more should do it. But what? I know, no. This is called the second lesson. Pardon me again. I like reading here at Rockhurst because these allusions to Mass and Catholicism probably are getting noticed by somebody. Anyway, this is called the second lesson. Oh, there's something else I should say about this poem. There's a line in here that is, I think when you write poems, sometimes you have to say things that are a little bit outrageous. And in other words, in order for the poem to be truly true, to be true. And so at one point, I allude to something and say this could only happen in St. Louis. And I say that because I grew up in St. Louis, and I think that it's a predominantly Catholic city. At least it was when I was growing up. It was very common. Most people were Catholics. And in fact, my brother, who lives in St. Louis, one time was pulled over during the day by a policeman, and the police, my brother doesn't really drink much, so he wasn't drinking. But the policeman, for some reason, asked him if he'd been drinking. And my brother looked at him and said, "It's Lent." And the policeman said, oh, yeah, okay, never mind. So, yeah, I kind of got a little bit of that in this poem. So anyway, that's kind of why it might sound ridiculous if you heard it, but that's the way it is. The second lesson. The woman holding my hand wears a cross of ashes today. Oh, excuse me. The woman holding my hand wears a cross of ashes on her forehead. I turn to the pew behind, filled with crosses of ash. Everyone squeezing my hand, saying, "Bless you." I say, "Bless you," to the officer who wants to speak to me on the way home with a cross of ashes on his forehead. This would happen only in St. Louis. Stan the man has a cross of ashes today. The cross of ashes staring at my driver's license says, "It will let me off this time." I turn into Tower Grove and sit on a bench in the sun. February's not what it once was. The first reading today said, not to perform righteous deeds in order that people might see them. A young man strides past my face. My grandson, Bobby, years ahead, nods. I nod back to him. Bless you. The second reading today said, now is the time. Now is the day. Kids put animal stickers up and down my sleeves, drawn as I am in the shape of everyone. I cannot lift my eyes to see the bruise of dust I carry. Thanks very much.